Welcome back to Cyber Defense Webinars. I'm your host, Gary Malevsky, and the publisher of Cyber Defense Magazine. By the way, this webinar is brought to you by Specops Software, an award-winning and leading provider of password management and authentication solutions. Visit them online at specopssoft.com. So today's webinar is talking about getting rid of end-user bad behavior with better password security. Today, we're joined by two wonderful guest speakers, Darren Siegel, a cybersecurity expert at Specops Software, and Clay Kirkland, a product specialist at Specops Software. Together, they have over 30 years of combined IT and IT security expertise. Gentlemen, we're really lucky to have you speak on this critical topic for 2023 and beyond. Welcome.
Hello all, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Gary.
All right, let's get started. Today we're also, of course, like Gary said, we're going to talk about passwords and user behavior. But first, a bit about us. Like I mentioned, we are, Clay and I are both with Specops Software. We are a password management company. We deal in password management, authentication. We've been around since 2001. You can see we are a global company. We started in Sweden about, in 2001, and now we are in lots and lots of places, you can see there. And most recently, we become a part of Outpost 24, which is a leading global cybersecurity company. My name is Darren Siegel. I've been here with Specops for about 6.5 years now. Lots and lots of years of IT experience beyond that. And then Clay, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I've been with Specops now for about 2 years. Have experience in various verticals and other IT roles.
All right. Next slide, just a quick high-level overview. What we're going to talk about, bad password behavior. Passwords are a user problem. That's really how I like to look at this. They are a security problem. They're a security problem because of the end users, because of the behavior. We're going to talk about what users do, why they do it, and then, of course, we're going to talk about some ways to mitigate that kind of behavior. We'll talk about what you can do with your current Windows environment, what you can't do with your current Windows environment. I'll show you some key resources to follow up, and then we will have a final Q&A session. But as Gary mentioned, we are open to questions throughout. Just hit them in the webinar chat, and we will field those as soon as we can. A landslide for passwords are hard to remember, which is a good one. We put this poll together. Every answer we think is a valid answer. In second place, frequency of forced password changes. That's a big one too. Forced password changes certainly lead to bad password behavior. Users fall into these very predictable patterns that we can talk about here today. Password requirements are unclear. No votes for that.
I'm a little disappointed with no votes for that one, Darren.
Yeah, because we're going to talk about that one, right? That's interesting. So, one of the things we see in Specops is we actually see password requirements being unclear as a large challenge for organizations, looking at frequency of calls to the help desk about password changes and just general end user experience feedback. When Windows says the password does not meet the length, complexity, and history requirements of the domain, users don't find that, particularly helpful. So it's still valid, maybe not the top reason, and that's fair to not answer it, but certainly something we are going to talk about today. Complexity of passwords being difficult to type. I think that depends on how you look at how you form your password. We used to always teach our end users to build passwords by coming up with a string of words and then taking the first character of every word and capitalizing one and turning another one into a special character. And you end up with this 6 or 8 or 10 character long string of nonsense, and then you have to type it and remember when you have to hold the shift key down and all these weird things. And again, certainly a challenge we see, but passwords are hard to remember. I actually fully agree with that being the biggest challenge. There are too many passwords. The password requirements are all over the place. Users are forced to keep track of all these passwords, and because they're forced to keep track of these passwords, they end up reusing passwords, which is something we want to address, and we're going to get into more of that as well. So thank you again for everyone who submitted answers there. Let's move forward and take a look at the next slide, please. All right, so some of those bad password behaviors, I already mentioned a couple of them. We'll just kind of go, we'll start at 12 o'clock, we'll go clockwise around this little graphic here. Users are creating weak passwords. What do I mean by a weak password, because you might look down and see, oh, easily guessed. Well, what's that different from a weak password? A weak password, primarily I think of as a short password that's 8 or 10, even 12 characters long. It is easy to guess. It is easy to brute force an 8-character password. If you have the SHA-1 or MD4 hash of an 8-character password, you can brute force that with a mid-tier graphics card pretty quickly and figure out what the base password is. Users are using short passwords because they're easy. They're easy to remember if they're shorter, if they haven't been trained how to create a long password that's memorable. So something we have to work against. Password reuse, using the same password over and over again. They've come up with a password. They love it. It's easy to remember. It's 15 characters long. It meets every oddball complexity requirement that has been thrown at them. And the users love it so much. And they're coming up against our #1 challenge for the poll of passwords being difficult to remember. And they're using the same password everywhere. So now they've solved the problem of passwords being hard to remember. The problem now is you end up with passwords that are easier to find by the bad guys because they've been used everywhere. Password sharing, kind of the same thing, around groups of users, around family members. Sharing your Netflix password, maybe, well, that's Netflix is making their own changes there. And so
That's going away.
Maybe not the worst thing in the world, but what other account information are people sharing among team members at work? Those shared accounts to log into secure devices and things like that are, those shared kind of, we call them generic accounts sometimes in the Windows world. You're sharing a password, it's probably going to be one that's pretty easy for everybody to remember. Something we want to work against. Easily guessed passwords. So now this might be my weak password, might be my reused password. I might be using a really common word in my password, and that makes it really easy to guess. I might have just grabbed some Starbucks coffee in the morning. I come back, I'm told to change my password. I look at that cup and I type in Starbucks 123, capital S at the beginning, exclamation point at the end. Boom, it's long enough, it's complex enough. It's also really, really easy for an attacker to guess. And we have some evidence to show that that's what we're seeing out there as attackers try to break into these systems. So that's something we want to mitigate. And then using compromised passwords. These are passwords that they might have been easily guessed. They might have been weak. They were definitely reused. What users are doing when use these same password over and over again, like I said, they're going to use the same password for work for a dozen different personal accounts. They're going to use it on some website that probably hasn't gone through a security audit recently, and the password, or at least the hash of that password, is now out there. Now that's compromised. So if anywhere else that user was using that password, if the attacker is able to get it in clear text one way or the other, they can start trying that password elsewhere. If they're using that password to sign into your enterprise network, that's a problem that we'd like to prevent as well. All right, let's take the next slide. Just some statistics.
Quick question. Sorry to interrupt. Quick question, Darren.
Yes.
Yeah, just a really quick question. So one thing I think a lot of people believe is that if they're in regulatory compliance, PCI, GLBA, HIPAA, high-tech, whatever the compliance is, and that compliance includes, best practices on password, that means they have good password hygiene, or does it not?
Compliance standards are far and wide, but they don't all solve the password problem, the password problems that we're seeing out there. Really, this first stat on the top left, we talk about compromised passwords. These are passwords we see in the data that we collect on passwords between public data breaches and honeypots that we have scattered around that are collecting live attack data. 80% of them satisfy length and complexity requirements. So those passwords are PCI compliant. They've got the 4 out of 4, they've got the length, they've got all that good stuff, but they're still compromised passwords. So yes, you've met those requirements. No, you have not mitigated those bad those bad user behaviors around passwords. And it's something really good to keep in mind. And it's a really good question to bring up, because we can't just stop at the bare minimum of ticking a box and saying, yes, we require upper or lower digit and special character in our passwords. Users still fall into very predictable behavior that do very predictable things that completely very often completely wipe out any benefits that you would get from getting in line with those compliance standards.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important that we restrict the use of those compromised passwords. We have customers asking us all the time, well, I've got these complexity requirements. Is that good enough? And the answer is always no. You've got to take a look at what NIST has said about blocking compromised passwords and being a huge component of good security posture today.
That's exactly right. We're seeing organizations that are breached, and those passwords are 4 out of 4 complex, but really easy to guess. So exactly, you got to have a multifaceted approach to making sure these passwords are locked down. Top right, the most common term found in passwords used to attack networks across multiple ports is still password. Password 1234 with a capital P. Long, it's complex. The attackers are still starting there. And the way we like to look at the way I like to think about this is, you look at what the attackers are doing. The attackers are having some level of success. They're out there, they're out on the dark web, they're out on the dark web to make money primarily, whatever their motivations are. They might be political, they might be financial, who knows? It's usually one or the other. But the things that they're trying got to be successful, or if they weren't, they would change tactics. So we're seeing these things out there. That means there's still targets out there that they're able to successfully hit. This bottom one, this kind of talks into what we do with our honeypots. We run a bunch of really, if you're not familiar with a honeypot, maybe you should back up and talk about that. The way we're using a honeypot, we've spun up what looks like a insecure system. It is an intentionally insecure system designed to get bad actors' attention so they start trying to log into it. So we put an RDP server out in the wild, or an SSH server out in the wild. It looks like an RDP server, it acts like an RDP server. It gives the same invalid credentials when you try to type something to log into it. Behind the scenes, all we're doing is collecting the login information. We're collecting what the attackers are trying. We know it's attackers because these systems are not published at all. So if an attacker found them, they were up to no good in the first place. And we see interesting stats. We see they're trying passwords, in this case, 12 characters or less. So again, if you're thinking, I've got a 12-character limit, or 12-character minimum on my passwords, and I'm covered, the attackers are trying the 12-character passwords. They know. And they're using base words like password, which is 8 characters just on its own. So you put that together, it's a little scary to think about, one, these attackers are trying this. We get a couple 100,000 hits a day on these systems out there, and they're trying things that have got to be successful, or they would be changing tactics. So kind of scary to think about, but that's what we're finding out there.
Yeah, and even though 12 characters is a good place to start from a brute force perspective, from computationally being difficult to brute force crack, it's not from a easily guessed perspective, like you're saying, Darren. So it's just a matter of time before somebody guesses the right thing versus trying to compute what that would be.
Exactly. And at that length, if they're trying to crack hashes or anything like that, they're not doing a brute force. You can do it. It might take you a couple of years still, or if you have a supercomputer from IBM, maybe it goes a little faster. But what they're doing is they're using word lists as a base, excuse me, and then going beyond that. So if I have a 12-character password, it's completely random. That's tough to brute force. If I have a 12-character password that starts with P@SSW0RD, now it's a little easier to brute force that password. So we want to get users away from those behaviors that can be predicted with word lists, even if they're long, even if they're meeting those regulatory requirements. All right, I think we should move on to the next slide. And we have another poll. So we could bring that up, please. This one, unlike the first poll, this one does have one correct answer.
Another cool poll, gentlemen. On average, how many passwords are stolen each week? 100,000 or 500,000 or 1 million or 5 million?
And there we go with 1 million. And maybe we shouldn't have put our source on the screen while we were asking the question, but yeah, password attacks are out there. Passwords are being stolen. This is happening. We're seeing it. Others are seeing it out there. And And just it's important to think about passwords are being stolen. They're not necessarily being stolen from your environment. Like I said, they're being stolen from these other applications that may not be secure. If they're reused, if they're giving hints even about what the passwords might be on those other systems because of those common base words. These passwords are out there, and the attackers are really exploiting that as best they can.
Well, and Darren, the interesting thing about that is that all I've got to do is correlate some basic data, like what's your email address, and then can they match a password hash to your username, and all of a sudden that data breach data becomes very handy in guessing a compromised password.
Oh yeah. We see the breaches as well as part of our research, and so we'll talk a little bit about what we find in them as we move forward here. So let's go on to the next slide. And this is what we're talking about. And so again, this is Specops is curating these lists of passwords. We're looking at them, we're deduping them, we're analyzing them, we're looking for patterns. If we're finding hashes, we are using word lists to try to reverse them and find the passwords. We're doing all sorts of things here, and we're finding really interesting things, really interesting patterns. And this is one that we highlighted in our most recent round of research: Fortune 500 company names appearing in compromised passwords. So earlier when I mentioned Starbucks 123 exclamation point, I wasn't picking on Starbucks. That's the first one I thought of out of this list of 10. The list goes on, of course, there's more beyond this. The top one kind of gets they're cheating a little bit. We got two different companies with Williams, and then we're not sure which one they're thinking of when they say Williams, but there it is. So you can see these lists. These are names everyone on this webinar, I'm sure, is going to recognize all of these names. This is the kind of stuff that's in passwords. This is the kind of stuff that's in password attacks. The attackers know this. They're working off the same lists we are. And again, why are users doing this? Because they don't have anything. They don't have anything that's telling them otherwise. They don't have anything that's enforcing them enforcing them to do something better. They don't have anything educating them on how to do something better. Their goal is to not have to worry too hard about remembering the password and all those other challenges we talked about. This is a way they can do it. It just works really well for the attackers as well. Let's jump to
quick question.
Yeah.
You analyzed how many millions of passwords that are compromised and how many total are out there on the dark web as of today? These numbers are incredibly significant.
Well, 1 million passwords are being captured a day. So it doesn't take long to add up to 800. Of course, there's duplicates, and we've been at this for more than 800 days. But it's a large data set that we've amassed. Any public data breach you've heard of, probably a lot more that you haven't heard of. We are scouring the dark web for passwords. We are running that network of honeypots. We get 200,000 hits a day off of that. It adds up pretty quickly.
I think that number is up over 3 billion of our total collected unique hashes, Darren.
Oh yeah, we also we do some other curating of it as well. We've got a larger list of 3 billion that we can work off of as well if we go with every last thing we've ever seen. But this is over the 800 million. That these are the passwords we really focus on based on where we found them, what we found in them.
Yeah, and how frequently we see them used against our
exactly. So we're doing some optimization in here, even with the data set, just because it just keeps growing and growing and growing as these password attacks just continue and get more powerful. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. We have a third poll. So now that we've thought about password reuse and compromised passwords, the kinds of passwords we're seeing out there, I want you to think about the users in your environment. Think about your user base. What percentage of them do you suspect are using a password that is already out there as part of a data breach?
Clay and Darren, while the poll is running, I would just add that I wouldn't be surprised. And I know before we get to the end of the webinar, we're going to have the tools to understand, thanks to you guys at Specops Software. But I would say every company's got to have at least one employee with a password on the dark web. With billions of records, and there's been more identity theft in the United States It seems that cyber crime is bigger than drug crime and identity theft is huge. So I wouldn't be surprised if every company has at least one employee. And we'll share the poll results in a sec.
Yeah, absolutely agree. There's a reason there's no zero option on this survey. We know what we work with organizations to identify these things. We've never seen a zero come back. An interesting results. Okay, so we have the far and away leader is the 26 to 50% range, and then pretty even split between 25 or less, 51 to 75, and we've got one for 75 plus, which that'd be on the high side actually, but certainly could be possible depending on what else you're doing with your password policies right now and what else your users are doing, based on the what tools they have today. But the 26 to 50 range, that's what I would have chosen as well. Now we're going to talk later in the demo, and Clay's going to show this to you, and Gary just alluded it to a bit. We have a tool where we can take that. It's actually up over 900 million now in the most latest version of the software. 900 million breach passwords. You get that as part of a as part of a data set. It's about 6 gig worth of password hashes, all compressed and optimized and all that good stuff. And you can run this scan and it will tell you the name of every user who's using a password on our list of breach passwords. We have no data on this. We have, aside from what our customers volunteer, because we don't collect stats out of that tool. But the 26 to 50 range, I think normally it ends up being right around the 25 mark, give or take. But it's pretty typical to run this and realize at least 1 out of every 5 users is using a breached password. So pretty spot on with what I would have expected there. Yeah, Clay, sound about right to you as well with the folks that you've been talking to in your role?
Yeah, I would say that especially once you get up to a sizable user base, that number pretty much correlates. It's somewhere, usually it's under 25%, but it's sometimes it bumps up over that depending upon whether new users were set with bad passwords and they just never changed them. That's always fun when somebody realizes they've got a bunch of accounts that share the same password. That usually causes a little bit of panic when the IT team runs the tool and sees that data. They get a little worried about, okay, how can we address this pretty quick? So
yeah, and we'll talk about that identical passwords report as well. But yeah, you're going to find every user who's using welcome 1 pretty quickly, and if there's a lot of them, yeah, that breach number goes up accordingly. All right, thanks, Clay. Let's go to the next slide. So now that we have maybe made you feel a little less easy about passwords than you did at the beginning of the call, I think it's time to start talking about some kind of some of the ways we can solve this problem. What can we do about end user behavior? What can we do about passwords to not have them be a gaping security hole in our environment? Now, the first thing that everyone talks about with passwords is multi-factor. Multi-factor is important. MFA, our first file on the left there, sorry. This is using a second factor as part of your authentication. Maybe it's a text message, maybe it's something as simple as a question. We see that a lot on websites, not so much in the enterprise space, but some websites use that as part of their sign-in. Authenticator app on your phone, which has like the password the 6-digit code that changes over every 30 seconds. A biometric like your Face ID, your fingerprint. In the enterprise space, there are all sorts of vendors out there that provide push notifications to apps on your phones, YubiKeys, or any other kind of hardware token. These solutions are out there. They are great. You should use them if you're not already. Every entry point to your environment, if it doesn't already, should have a multi-factor authentication on it where you combine one of these phone-based things or one of these hardware token-based things with a password. You want that. We always used to call it something you know plus something you have. Something you know is the password, something you have is that device or that hardware token. Or you might always hear something you are, which was a fancy way of saying your fingerprint, your Face ID. Yes, you have a fingerprint, but it's more of a, anyway. The thing we see about MFA, and it's interesting to hear when we talk to some customers about this, when we talk to other organizations about this, is A lot of CTOs, a lot of CIOs, a lot of decision makers will look at this and say, I spent all this money on this multi-factor system. I've gone through the trouble to set it up. Why am I still worried about passwords? And the answer is, because you still have a password as part of the authentication story. MFA is great. It's great to add the layers of security, great to add steps to what a bad actor needs to do to get in. But if you ignore the password, if the password stays easy to guess, if the password stays as something that was reused from a data breach and the attacker knows that, then the attacker's halfway in. They only have one more factor to break. And MFA is not impervious to attacks. We see all sorts of ways MFA is broken in, whether it's social engineering or fatigue attacks or SIM spoofing. You can get around it, so you can't ignore the password and just trust the MFA to keep the bad actors out of there.
Darren, a quick question on MFA. I keep hearing about MFA fatigue or MFA spamming. Could you share that with our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. MFA fatigue or MFA spamming, which is really a better way of putting that. This is a way that a bad actor will essentially annoy the user that is in possession of the MFA device until they relent and hit approve on an authentication request. So think about, you are signing into a system, you have one of those phone-based authenticators, you type in your username, you type in your password, the next thing happens is your phone buzzes and you can hit approve, and maybe you got to do a fingerprint or a Face ID on top of that. And that's great for end user experience, that push notification, that quick approval. The users love it, it's easy, it adds that security. But the attackers found that they can exploit how easy it is to use those factors. If they can figure out the password and get past that step and send the push notification, or maybe they found a way to push it even without the password, they'll just keep sending push notification requests to that user's phone. They'll send 10, 20, 30 at a time. The user's phone is just going to keep buzzing. Now, if that happens to anyone on this call who's in the security space, in the IT space, and is aware of these kinds of attacks, deny that, report that, figure out where it's coming from, shut it down. An end user is just going to get annoyed their phone is buzzing, and on the 30th request, they get tired, they hit that fatigue moment, and they hit approve, and their phone stops buzzing, and they're happy, and the attacker is happy because now they're in. So it's kind of like a social engineering, but more like just I'm going to drain this end user's phone battery if they don't hit approve on one of these requests, and they'll just keep trying until one or the other happens, and it's successful. We've seen organizations have been compromised by this kind of attack. So
Darren, I've actually got a question. So with all the talk about passwordless, but does that negate the need that we have to do any of this other stuff, or is that the answer?
The passwordless movement is, again, great for user experience. If you're using something like Windows Hello with a biometric to unlock your laptop, great end user experience. But again, you have not eliminated the password. Even on that Windows device, I can hit sign in options and click in password and type the password. The password's still out on the network. It could still be the factor for a VPN endpoint or a web portal or something. So it's still out there. We're saving the user the trouble of typing the password, which is really nice, but we're not improving the security of passwords. You're providing another way to ignore them with passwordless, and you cannot do that because the attackers, they know the password's still out there and they're still trying it. It's a really good question, though. Thanks for bringing that one up. Strong passwords, center tile here. We're going to talk about this. We've already talked about this a bunch. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but we need the users to pick strong passwords. How are we going to get them there? It's going to come down to a combination of enforcement, which we're going to show you how we do that, and the third tile on the right here, the end user experience. Users need to know what we're asking of them when they're changing their passwords. If they don't, they're going to fall right back into some of these bad behaviors. They're going to fall right back into doing something that's really easy to remember, pretty likely to pass whatever requirements IT is thrown at them. if we can provide a better user experience, if we can show them as they're typing that they're hitting all of the requirements, if we can give them very specific feedback, if they've used a common base term or if they've used a password that we know is already in a data breach, your users are going to be, first off, you tell them they're using a breach password, that's really good feedback for a few reasons, not the least of which they might be going and changing all their bank account passwords as soon as they're done with this one. But the users need to know what's happening. If they don't, they're going to call the help desk, they're going to get annoyed, or they're going to very quietly fall into those bad behaviors and set a password that the attackers are going to very easily figure out. Let's go to the next slide, please.
And I have a quick question. Isn't it true that users really are not aware of why their passwords are bad? They really don't understand why.
That's exactly it. The tools that are built into the, a lot of the tools that they're given do not give real-time feedback. Sometimes don't even give after the fact feedback. I already alluded to it once, but you change your password on a Windows desktop. We've been seeing the same feedback message for as long as Windows has been around about not meeting the length and the complexity and the history requirements of the domain. If that's all you're telling your end user, how are they going to know which one of those three they missed? They don't. So they have to guess, or they have to, again, they've figured out a behavior that is terrible for security that they know generally gets them away from seeing that message. So we have to solve that if we ever hope to get our users setting the kinds of passwords we need them to be setting. Really good question. Quick slide here. We don't talk much about other solutions out there, but if you're in a Windows environment, you may be thinking, I already have a password policy in place. I may already have Azure, if I have a premium license. These tools that Microsoft gives you or builds into their solutions still don't get us all the way there. And just want to point out some of the shortcomings across the top line. Really, these are the enforcement things that we're missing. Custom dictionary lists. Yes, you have a custom dictionary list in Azure. Yes, your users can still set a password with a word in that custom list due to the scoring system they use. Essentially, a dictionary word plus 4 other random characters is still an acceptable password, which is not ideal. Compromised passwords, Microsoft flat out says they don't even try to address that problem. I'm not sure why. We can help you though. And even something like the custom character requirements, if you need something like that for your upper lower digits special for compliance, you can't even do that with Microsoft. Across the bottom, that end user experience, which is I'm going to keep harping on it because it is so critical to solving this problem. If you're going to have password expiration, if you have forced password expiration, you have to do every 90 days for compliance. There's no choice. Let the user know that the password change is coming and let them know what the password policy is when you do so. A little toast notification in the corner of my Windows machine is going to be ignored. It isn't terribly useful anyway. If I can send them an email telling them how to change their password, where to change their password, what the requirements are, they can start thinking about their new password well before they're forced to change it. So you don't throw these rules at them at the last second. It makes for a hugely more intuitive end user experience, and users will be thrilled that IT is actually telling them what they need to do. Length-based agent, we're going to talk about this. This is kind of a cool feature. If you don't have one of those compliance standards that says you have to change your password every so often, length-based aging is a nice way of rewarding your end users. We want those longer passwords. We know that we're talking about 12-character passwords or less in attacks. Users might not want to pick a longer password. That's okay. We can train them on passphrase and using 3 random words and all that good stuff. And 2 things are going to happen. First off, the password's going to get a lot longer. It's going to get a whole lot difficult to crack. But we want to reward the end user. We want to say, okay, now that you've done this, we're not going to make you change your password every 90 days. We might give you 6 months, a year. We might say, and I said we have some works doing this, just never change that password ever again unless we find it down the line on a compromise list. We can do that. Microsoft, again, they don't even try these kinds of things. And then that real-time feedback, which Clay is going to show us in just a second here. I'll say it again. I say it all day, every day. This is the key to getting your users choosing good passwords, showing them what it is they need to do, educating them as they're in the process of a password change as to what it is they need to do to pick a password that's going to be resilient against any password-based attack. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Clay, who's going to show us a demo of Specops password policy and our breach password protection and our Specops password auditor. Anyway, Clay, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. All right. All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the correct screen here. All right. And so we're going to start with our end user machine. This does have our software installed in this environment, as well as what we call our authentication client, which allows us to demonstrate feedback to the end users like we talked about. And so here at change of password in Windows, we've got our rule set generated now by our authentication client. It does show us the complexity rules that we've got in this domain. It shows us the rules that we can check ahead of time. So we've got a complex set of complexity requirements here that have multiple variables in here. We also can restrict use of a username. We can also restrict the use of 3 or more consecutive identical characters. We can check all that again in real time. We also can check the custom dictionary list that Darren talked about earlier. We can check our list of known compromised or breached passwords. It's about 960 million today in the list that gets checked in real time. We can obviously check a previous password history, and then we can also have a requirement where it differs from the last character. So we can do a little demonstration of how this plays out. And so what will happen is if I begin typing in real time, it will show the user that they're meeting the requirements. It will show them that the password they submitted is attempting to submit has matched. It will also, depending if you turn on the link-based aging feature that Darren mentioned, we can really encourage them to use a longer password. It's obviously exceeded the 14-character minimum, but now it's even longer at 20 characters in this demonstration, and we've set this to never expire. So if I hit submit here, you can see what I typed in. It's really long, but it will come back and say, well, I can't use Specops in my password because that's in our restricted list. You know, we don't want users using company names, sports teams, locations, any product names you may have, anything that would be really easy for an end user to do, like Starbucks, for example, or one of the Fortune companies that were mentioned in an earlier slide. We can also come back in here to demonstrate a few things about the feedback. When we're talking about complexity being not enough, it's important to understand that I can have a password that may meet all the requirements, that looks something like this, famously has password in the password, meets all of our requirements, and might pass every other characteristic we have. But if I submit it, we want to be able to block that and restrict the use of a breached password. So you can see here, it was still a good password, but it was on the compromised list. Now, how all of that takes place is, again, we have an authentication client installed on these endpoints that integrates as a credential provider, and then we deliver these policies via group policy objects. So they're user-based policies in Active Directory, and I can set things to be much more restrictive than the default AD settings here. Where I configured my complexity groups, if that's a requirement, as well as the custom dictionary, which is the list of restricted words in the end user experience. And so we typically find words that are unique to your organization. Again, locations, all of these are words that are either specific to our organization at Specops, our corporate office locations, the seasons. There's obviously anything that you want to put in here. We don't encourage you to use this for the entire Oxford Dictionary, but it is great to target those words that are commonly used by users in your organization. And so we can also,
Clay, I think it's important to point out with that list, we are doing some more creative things with that as well. This is a case insensitive search. And we're also doing, well, whether you call it leet speak or character substitution or normalization. You know, if we wanted, you know, if Clay said, you know, as an end user said, oh, Specops isn't allowed, but what about, you know, SP3C 0 PS, just 3 for an E, 0 for the O, you know, the ats for the A's, et cetera, et cetera. We're detecting all those automatically here as well. So you can configure a simple list. It's real easy. As an admin, you know, think about those common words, get the team together, you know, whiteboard up, you know, here's my, everyone come up with your top 100 words, top 50 words that we think our users might use. Throw them all in here. You don't need to worry about all those variations. We know about them. The attackers know about them. Like I mentioned, these tools that attackers use to crack passwords, they feed them word lists, and the tools just do all those same things automatically. So we do it automatically on enforcement so that your users get to be a little more creative than picking a symbol that looks an awful lot like the number that would have been there instead.
exactly. Yeah, thanks for that, Darren. So some other things that are worth noting here in the policy engine. If you need to block certain strings of characters, say you've got a system requirement, you can always use regular expressions to block certain character patterns. You can get fairly complex with those. But really the star of the show is the breach password protection engine, which allows us to prevent users from changing to a leaked password with our list of 960 million or over 960 million known compromised hashes that are in your environment. So that list lives inside of your domain and can be checked by any domain controller in real time. We can also check for those leaked passwords daily and send a notification to your end users. We can also force them to change it should they be detected within your environment.
Hey, Clay, a quick question. Is this totally customer confidential, customer controlled, except for maybe the breach protection updates?
Yeah, that's correct, Gary. These are all self-contained. This is all within your Active Directory environment. We don't have any access to this. And so it's great for customers, especially even within isolated environments. Say you've got a SCADA network or an environment where it's totally isolated, you can always import the list without having to connect to the internet. So once these tools are installed, they are independent from internet connectivity. So we also have the ability in here to do, as Darren mentioned, the length-based expiration. So my password was over 23 characters before, and so we have it set here to never expire. A really great way to encourage your users to use longer passwords. We also have the ability to generate HTML-based emails. So I can come in here. You can drop your corporate template in here via the HTML code and fairly quickly get up and running with being able to send out notifications to your end users. And so those variables would look something like this as I close out of the policy engine real quickly to show you that. It would look something like this sent to your end user. So you can see here, we've got our rule set broken out as you saw in the end user demo, and then the link to reset their password. So the list of breach passwords does live within your AD environment in Sysvol. So that's so we can guarantee that it gets replicated around to all of your domain controllers. And it is about 6 gigs today for that list of 960 million hashes. The tool does need to be installed on all of your writable domain controllers. As you may know, you cannot guarantee or control which domain controller processes a password change due to AD's architecture. And the last thing that we'll talk about today is actually our password auditor tool, which is a free tool that we've mentioned. This does use our breach password list, the list of 960 million hashes. This is an offline tool. You do not need to be connected to the internet to run the tool. You obviously do need to connect to the internet to download the breach passwords. So I've got the list already downloaded here in our environment. So if I begin the scan, What it's using is domain admin credentials to do a hash compare against what's in our list, as well as pulling additional data from AD. And so once we come in here, we can see some things that are very interesting. Our breach password report here to show us which accounts are using a known compromised hash. You can see here, obviously, that there are several here within our demonstration environment. You can export that list of usernames, begin attacking that, and just to know how big your problem might or might not be. Again, back to our panel question, there are about 120 accounts in this environment, and ours just happens to be at that about that 25% mark. One of the other things that we mentioned was the comparison of accounts that have the same password hash. So you also would want to come check that out and see if you can resolve that issue within your environment.
Clay, I just want to interject for a second. This is foundational cybersecurity technology that is missing if they don't have this tool. All of our viewers and listeners and the replay folks, they need to get this free password auditing tool. I know you're going to have a link at the end, but it seems to me that if you're going to find breach passwords in every network in the world, then you've got to have a tool like this immediately to find it. And it's amazing that you guys are giving it away for free. The second question I have, which may be more about the product suite that you sell. Let's say we got breached, we got a ransomware attack. We've got some resiliency, we're restoring backups. Clay, can you provide a secure process to reset all employee passwords after a ransomware attack?
Sure, we actually have that documented on our blog. When the White House announced that they recommended that back last year, we actually documented that process. But you would want to take into consideration whether, if it's not the result of a breach and you just want to force one, that you may not want to reset everyone's password at the same time. That might cause your help desk to get overwhelmed. But right, yes, that's something you can absolutely do programmatically. So Darren, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out, you're going to force your password changes if you're unfortunately in one of these situations, or just as a general best practice. No, you're going to force password changes the way you normally would. User must change password next logon, audit password last set to make sure people are actually changing their passwords. You're going to go through all that process. If you've had a breach, you're going to have to. I've been through it. I was consulting for an organization I'm not allowed to name several years ago. I watched them go through it. It's not fun. But if you have the tools to enforce good passwords, if you have the tools to tell the user the password policy as they're changing their password, you're going to be able to get through that forced password cycle a whole lot easier with a whole lot fewer calls to the help desk. And at the end, you're going to have a level of confidence you would never get without a tool like this, that the users didn't just use the same weak passwords or easily guessed passwords that got you in that situation in the first place.
Yeah, I think the best part is that we've made that tool free so that you can gather that data without a whole lot of extra work to know where your environment stands, to get that hygiene snapshot.
All right, so thank you, Clay, for the demo. Again, that was awesome. Just some quick notes on where we can go from here. Of course, the fine folks at Cyber Defense Magazine have a review of Specops password policy available. You can see the URL down at the bottom there. It's a very detailed review. You can see, everything Clay has shown in the demo and likely more. We would certainly encourage you to go and check that out. And then the next final slide here, some other resources to talk about from what we provide at the Specops side. Go to our website, specopssoft.com. You're going to find a couple of things there. You will find, and you may have seen it through other channels as well. We've got, it's all over my LinkedIn feed, of course, but this 2023 week password report. This is the second year we've done this. This is a much more detailed summary of the research that we alluded to and talked about a little bit earlier in the presentation today. Go and read it. It talks about the kind of data we find, the kind of patterns we're finding out there. It's a really good read. You might be surprised by some of the things that we found in there. And then, of course, as we've already talked about a couple times, you can download that password auditor free for our website as well. Pull it down, run it in your environment. If you have any questions beyond that on how to enforce some of the things we talked about today, based on what you found, you can contact us through the website as well, and we'll be happy to tell you more. All right, and just one final thank you. I'll kick it back to Gary to wrap this up. And if there's any final questions, anything else you'd like to ask, we do have a few minutes left here, so please ask away.
First off, I want to thank you both for an amazing presentation, a great demo. And again, I think this is foundational, must-have technology. I'm surprised that that so many companies have so many breached passwords, and we've all experienced identity theft and so many issues. And you guys are hunting it on the dark web daily, so I don't have to. So thank you for that. The auditing tool, the free auditing tool, our viewers and listeners, you've got to get a hold of that tool ASAP. And folks, now is the time. If you have any more questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A area, and we'll just hold for a minute or two for questions. And don't forget, grab your password auditing tool and start auditing as soon as you can. And these folks at Specops Software are just amazing. I'm just so impressed. This is one of my favorite webinars because you can get off the webinar, grab the tool, and solve a big headache that you might not have known you had. And what kind of leverage for IT? We're always being blamed for problems in IT. They say the CISOs are all Dr. No, right? But to actually say to an employee, well, the reason we had to do that is because your password's on the dark web. You've been breached. It could be the CEO. It could be the CFO. It doesn't matter who the person is. And as you demonstrated, there's an example of a great password that meets all the requirements, but just happens to be on the dark web, like the Starbucks or the password and things like that. Just phenomenal. Folks, any questions? If there are no questions, I'll just share my comments on what I learned. Common bad password behavior. What a nightmare without tools like yours. What can the IT team enforce? And, multi-factor authentication alone is not enough. Microsoft has some great tools, fine-grained password policies and a zero protection, but it doesn't cut it alone. And really enforcing strong password policies tied into real-time knowledge of the dark web, that's incredible. So Darren Siegel and Clay Kirkland, thank you so much for educating us on this critical topic on how to get rid of end users' bad password behavior, better password security. And then folks, remember to come back next time for an exciting episode of Cyber Defense Webinars. Thank you both so much.
All right, thank you as well.
Thanks, Gary.
All right, we will wrap up. No more questions. Thanks again, folks. See you again soon.